Gregory, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time. I know that you're an extremely busy man, travelling the world, teaching meditation and insight dialogue retreats. So we're very lucky to have your time today. And Gregory Kramer, just to introduce a little bit of what you do to the listeners who aren't aware of your practice. Gregory Kramer is from America and is a leader in the field of insight dialogue, which is actually a practice that he developed, which we will go into through the interview. And he travels internationally teaching retreats on this practice, which is very much in line with mindfulness and bringing mindfulness into communication. So we'll hear more about that. But to begin with, Gregory, I wanted to ask you some general questions about meditation. And the first one was, why do you meditate? What value does it bring into your life? Because this is a question that a lot of people wonder.
Sure.
So for you personally, why do you meditate?
When I sit in the morning and I have enough time for the mind to get calmer than it usually is, let's just put it that way, it could be very calm, it might be a little calm, but more than usual, right? It's like sets up a whole different reference point for my life, so that it's sort of like, can you know what noise is if you don't know what silence is? Can you know what stillness is if you don't know what action is? Can you know what light is if you don't know what dark is? So touching some, something that is not tied up with all the machinations of my mind, not tied up with all the important things I have to do, not tied up with all of my emotional concerns, but it's just some quality of awareness, quality of just knowing, okay, here I am now, that isn't of all that. That's not frantic, that's not identified, that's not stressed, or any of it. That provides a reference point for everything else, so that one can know when one is stressed. Oh, this is different than that. One can know when one is preoccupied. Oh, I know what it's like to not be preoccupied, and right now I'm preoccupied. So it sets a whole different benchmark on my entire life. And I could go into lots of other advantages and details, but when you ask for one, that's the one that comes right now.
I understand it's a pretty big question. So I think what you've touched on in terms of recognizing contrasts is really interesting as well. And it sort of leads into another question that I wanted to ask you, which is around contrasts. For many people that start meditation, there's an instruction in meditation often to sort of be present, let go of past, let go of the future. But we live in a world where we need to plan, and being future orientated is sort of is a necessity to some extent. So could you speak a little bit to this seeming contradiction that comes up for people especially when they start meditation, and how you see the relationship perhaps between sort of being and doing, or is there a contradiction here?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's good to recognize that what we usually think of as decisions that we make very intentionally, plans that we make with great care, most often are coming entirely out of this conditioned and reactive framework. Oh, I better do it this way because, or I have to plan this because, and the because is a big accumulation of history, of emotions, of ideas. And so we get stuck inside this basket of our life history. It's sort of like that, what I said just a moment ago. How can you know what's not stressed unless you touch it? How can you know what stress is unless you've touched something that isn't it? It's like that. How can you know what it is to make a decision with clarity? How can you know what it is to make a decision with deep creativity and spontaneity, not just drawing from your old bucket of longings or your old bucket of preconceptions? How do you know that you're not stuck in that bucket? And yet if we don't take the time to come into the moment sometimes, you know? Maybe we're not going to dwell there all the time, but we say, okay, I can be aware of the reactive nature of my mind or the pressures I feel, and I'm now going to make some decisions. Now, if it's a minor decision, well, it's not such a big deal whether you order coffee with or without milk, you know? And so who cares? Maybe you're not mindful. What's the big deal? Attach all you want to your notions of coffee and milk, right? But if you're talking about, you know, do I want to marry this person? Or should I stay with my job? Or what do I do about my mom who, you know, needs care? Or my child is doing this, or my partner is having this issue, or I really have to make a business decision that takes a lot, you know, it's an important one. Do you want to be stuck? Do you want to be locked in to a framework that has really created your whole situation in the first place? So it's not that you don't use your intelligence. It's not that you don't plan. Planning is fine, but is the planning mind touching something that is awake and creative and alive, or is the planning mind coming only from this reactive place? That's a choice. You can make that choice if you know the difference. If you don't know the difference, no choice. No choice. The plans are just going to reflect the same old patterns over and over and over.
Beautiful. I'm very much enjoying hearing your answers to these questions. And you talk about the point choice there, and I think to me that's really so much about what meditation practice is. It's really allowing for more possibilities through awareness of what's actually going on.
And I should say, if I may, what's going on within you, but also what's going on around you, or put it the other way, what's going on around you, because we usually say, okay, I'm aware of what's going on out there, but you've also added to it this, what's going on internally, not just in my thoughts. How's my body responding? How, you know, what's the emotional edge here? And it's not only brings you more into the moment to be aware of the body, but it's also where you touch the more subtle decision-making capacities. I mean, there's a lot of science on decision-making, and a tremendous amount of it now points to the, shall we say, emotional, embodied aspect of being where decisions ultimately get made and where the best decisions come from. And they're filtered or used with, you know, the intellect that reviews them. Perfect. But you need to review what is really alive and awake and not bound up by preconception. And then the intellect can come in and say, is this a good idea or not? You see, that's fine. But if you only function from preconception, from intellect, and so on, you're going to have trouble. So the awareness is not just awareness of the world, but it's awareness internally. And meditation begins by developing this internal awareness. But as it matures, you get fluid with the internal and the external. You can move in that space knowledgeably, intentionally, spontaneously, in all kinds of ways.
That's probably a really good segue into bringing the conversation more towards the practice that you've developed, which is called Insight Dialogue. And, you know, you've written an entire book on it called Insight Dialogue, The Interpersonal Path to Freedom. And I highly recommend it to the listeners. But for the purpose of the interview, can you briefly give us a feeling of what Insight Dialogue is and how it relates to sort of bringing mindfulness into communication?
Insight Dialogue is based on traditional Buddhist insight meditation, Vipassana, and that's the primary source of the whole mindfulness movement, right? Mindfulness drew its inspiration and its techniques largely, almost entirely, from Buddhist insight meditation. And then taking that quality of mindfulness, which is, you know, this remembering each moment, what is happening here and now, remembering this body, remembering to notice, let's say, oh, what I'm being mindful of is this, like if it's being mindful of you, right? And being mindful of my emotions and so on and so forth. So there's a quality of remembering there. Well, you develop as you practice this insight meditation, these mindfulness practices, the basic starting point, the reference point is mindfulness internally. I'm mindful of my breath and it helps me calm down. I'm mindful of my walking and it helps me be more in the moment. I'm mindful of my thoughts and it helps me begin to calm them down and know the nature of the thinking mind. I'm mindful of this, these kinds of techniques, right? But what happens is this leaves kind of a gap. You develop this mindfulness, this remembering quality, this wakeful quality when you're still and calm and my eyes are closed and you're not with anyone and it's simple, which is really good. It's a good starting point. It's the foundation. But when you open your eyes and you see this other person and like, wow, someone's looking back at you. And it's, we're wired for this incredible sensitivity. We look in each other's eyes and all of a sudden the whole organism is vibrating. I mean, we're built like that genetically, physiologically, neurologically. We're exquisitely sensitive to other human beings. So it's a good thing to begin your meditation practice with that simplicity of internal mindfulness. But when you then open your eyes and engage with others, if you haven't done something like insight dialogue, you're going to most likely be quite reactive, and mindfulness will be very difficult to remember, to sustain. So insight dialogue is a specific practice with, very specific meditation instructions or guidelines that is crafted and taught to develop that mindfulness interpersonally, not just in pairs, but with, 3, 4, or with anyone, and ultimately with all experience.
Mm. Do you think that you would be able to just touch on what these guidelines are? I mean, again, I know you spend, a couple of chapters developing and speaking about each of them, but just so that it brings it more into something tangible for people.
Sure. There are 6 guidelines. The first is pause, and that pause, that's quality of stopping, is a quality of remembering, stopping and remembering, coming home to the body, coming home to this relational moment. So it's mindfulness. The pause is remembering mindfulness, establishing it, letting go of where we were. Then the next meditation instruction is relax. And pause, relax is, you can attune to where there might be any muscle tension in the face, the throat, the gut, the jaw, wherever. But that's just the surface, right? Because where we usually are not relaxed is in our crazy minds. But we can't always control it, right? It's just not, we're not relaxed. So really relax is accept. So what relax is to the body, accept is to the mind. So pause, relax, accept. It's like this right now. It has this quality of just resting and experience. So it's tranquility, concentration, stabilizes the mindfulness. Pause, relax, open. And open is exactly this thing we were talking about earlier of the internal awareness, the external, and both. So that we're mindful internally of feelings, thoughts, and so on, externally of the other, and both, meaning this relational between. And really, it's has a sense of a spatial, inclusive awareness where there's really no external and internal. It's just all. It's just very wide and open. So pause, relax, open. And when you're open in the world and aware like this, you begin to sense the vibrating quality, that constant change. Attuning to that change is the next meditation instruction, trust emergence. So it's kind of attuning to the emergence and the vanishing of things, of the world, of sensations, of feelings, the dynamic interchange with another person, unpredictable. It's about this don't know mind coming right to the edge, trusting emergence right there, kind of surfing the moment. And then the final two are listen deeply and speak the truth, which sounds obvious and trivial, actually, but when you take this into meditation practice with a high degree of mindfulness, concentration, and so on, the quality of listening extends beyond what even a good professional listener usually touches. One becomes extraordinarily stable and receptive and attuned. And then in Speak the Truth, you're actually bringing what I consider to be one of the greatest challenges of meditation right into this practice, which is the mind of simple awareness comes together with all of the constructing of the conceiving mind, of the emotional mind, of the storytelling mind. Can you speak of this life, this very lived life, and still have that quality of stable awareness? Can you bring those together, or is it always going to be this big gap between mindfulness and, all the stuff of my personality and my life and everything? Even my conceptual mind can be brought in. But to speak the truth is to speak with mindfulness and stability and depth of meditation practice, even as you're talking, and of course with listen deeply, even as you're listening. So it's quite a profound, you might say, demanding aspect of the practice.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. That's very, very helpful to kind of just give some sense, of what it is. I mean, I obviously spent 10 days practicing this with you in a retreat, so it's very hard to bring it into such a summarized version. But yeah, that's very helpful.
I figure if someone can even get the taste that such a thing might be possible, we've done a good job.
Yeah. Can I ask you, the insight dialogue that you teach around the world? I noticed that you take it to various different contexts, and I wondered about this practice in leadership. Can you speak to that? Have you done workshops where you help sort of leaders, and how do you see this practice as relating to being a good leader or people that are in leadership roles?
Yeah, I hear you. So first, mostly what I do is I teach meditation to anyone who is understanding that there's some value here. They want to come to a retreat and they've tasted something of the power of meditation and they want to really develop and deepen their practice. So it's about suffering and the end of suffering. It's really basic. So it's not about leadership. It's not about couples. It's not about communication. It's not about just another mindfulness practice. It's really at this very fundamental level, what in this life is stressful and confused and dark and difficult, and is it possible to know that and meet it in a way that is awakening, and then doing that relationally brings that into our relational lives. But more than that, it draws on the power of practicing with another person to sharpen that awareness, to deepen that inquiry, to hold steady that concentration, right? That's what relational practice can do. It can really strengthen and deepen your practice, at the same time making it applicable to your whole relational life, which is most of your when you're not sleeping, most of your time is somehow engaged with other people. So that's really what I do. Mm-hmm. So the question, if you'll allow me to reframe it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. The question that I might ask along those lines is, how might engaging this practice in depth at a retreat and perhaps following on with a group or something be of value to someone who is a leader or aspiring to lead or lead well or something like that. That's how I would frame the question. Rather than think about a retreat just for leaders or something, right?
Yep.
So, what is leadership at its essence? It's relational, right? In other words, if there's not another person, there's no one to lead, and there's no leading, and there's no leader, right? It's a relational act, leadership. And so I think any leader that you would speak with would readily acknowledge that the capacity to be attuned to people, the capacity to be balanced and awake and deeply intelligent while with, if not one other person, then a work group or the people in a whole organization and the people you relate to who then relate to others in the organization as you set a certain tone of relationship with those around you, it's naturally going to flow out to others, right? So there's hardly anyone, I think, in a leadership position that would say that that quality of presence, of intelligence, of creativity, and of equanimity is not critical, right? So that's my assumption, right? And it's exactly those qualities that I see unfolding for people at retreats and that they see. I mean, I get, I've taught thousands of people and I get a lot of feedback. It's very beautiful. It's very lovely to hear people's lives being changed. And there are patterns in that feedback. Things like a lot of people finding greater kindness to themselves, greater self-compassion. A lot of people finding themselves listening very differently to others, and people who find themselves stepping out of old habits of speech and so on, and people who are actually at a very basic level shifting out of patterns of hunger, living life from a sense of absence and lack, right? So real basic stuff. Included in that is people leaving feeling inspired and energized around how they can interact with people in situations that is far more equanimous, balanced, sort of standing in the middle when there's difficulty. And also it's not just about, doing better in difficulty. It's about seeing the positive possibilities you didn't see before too, So, we touched on the guidelines briefly. So that might be a touch point for what it would bring to leadership. I mean, there's plenty of people now writing about the mindful leader, mindful leadership, mindfulness in leadership, and mindfulness teachers and mindfulness coaches or coaching leaders in mindfulness. And leaders, mindfulness leaders, it's a big deal, it's like a fad, right? But, how do you bring it into your relational practice in the moment and keep it sharp?
Yeah,
right?
Thank you. I wanted to ask you one final question. When we were on retreat, there was some beautiful music emanating from the main area, and then we discovered that you're also a musician or composer. I wanted to ask you what you see, if any, the relationship between meditation and creativity for you.
Well, I should clarify. I used to be, a composer and quite serious, and I, taught music composition at New York University and got grants and all that kind of stuff. Did music for video and dance and concerts and everything. But nowadays, all I do is sit down to play, and I improvise. awareness, right? So to call me a composer is a very generous thing to do, but so thank you. But it actually allows me to answer your question in a simple and direct way, because for me, music always, since I was a teenager, I started when I was 5, but since I started improvising when I was like 14 or so, always been about coming to the edge. And when I was old enough to know what that edge was, like 17, 18, I started being aware that that edge was awareness itself. And so my meditation practice is coming to the edge of this unfolding moment of awareness, like being with you and talking and saying each word that I say and being present, right? So this is the moment. This is the edge of this encounter. You and I speaking, people are listening, and so on. So I bring that to the piano and enter that moment. And as soon as I fall into any desire to perform, to gain compliments or something like this, as soon as I fall into wanting to impress people, as soon as I fall into wanting to make it sound good, as soon as I fall into trying to make a style, as soon as I fall into any of these doorways of limitation, right? It's exactly tantamount to falling out of the moment, right? I'm falling into a cliche. It may even be my own stylistic cliche, right? So I would suggest that in any creative act, even if it's not improvised, it's just easier to talk about it when it's improvised, but you could come back and craft a piece, and you're still in the moment of crafting. And you can come back the next day and the next day, and you can work on an oil painting or a sculpture for 3 years, and it's always that moment. And when someone comes to encounter your sculpture or your painting or whatever it is that's, that you've made, that's the moment, right? So it's in that sense, it's always about that quality of awareness and love that can come through it or not. And meditation, to me, is very much about touching that awareness, touching that love, and dwelling, right? So it's not separate.
Thank you very, very much. Before we end, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share anything else that you feel we could talk for hours about all of this, but is there anything else that you would like to add to the conversation about Insight Dialogue or about the work that you do?
Probably just to say, the sense of if you're endeavoring to bring meditation, mindfulness practices, all this kind of thing to people in ways that it can filter into their lives, just to share a sense of compassion for all the challenges to doing that, of bringing it to people in such a way, but also people who, for all of us, life has so many compelling factors. A child gets ill, a friend breaks a leg and we have to run over there. We get fired from our job. All these things press and press and press and press on us. And that's, it makes sense that it's hard to pause. It makes sense that we don't give it a priority. So I really want to encourage a kindness to ourselves about that, and a sense of hope that if we can make our moments of relational contact, moments of mutual remembering, mutual awakening, ground them in kindness and compassion and in awareness, then that which usually causes us to spin out causes us to spin in, to really arrive. So I think there's real hope.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks very much.
And just so listeners can very quickly find you and read more about your work, can you just confirm your website for me? It was
Sure, metta.org, metta.org. And metta is the Pali word for loving kindness or for spiritual friendliness, something like that.
Great. Thank you very much, Gregory.
Wonderful, Elise.